The winter of 1848 came early to the northern plains. A trading party of 9 men left Fort Laramie in late October, heading northwest along the Powder River toward a settlement that was roughly 4 days of travel in good conditions. The conditions were not good. A storm arrived on the second night, not the worst storm that region had ever seen, not even close to it, and by the morning of the third day, 4 of the 9 men were already showing signs of severe frostbite. Their fingers had gone white. 2 of them could no longer feel their feet inside their boots. The temperature had dropped somewhere below 0 during the night, and the wind, which had been steady since before dawn, was driving the cold through their coats in a way that none of them had experienced before. By the 4th day, 2 men were unable to walk without assistance from the men beside them. The party made camp in a shallow ravine, the best shelter they could find on ground that offered almost none, and sent 2 men ahead on the strongest horses to find help or a settlement. The 2 men who went ahead never arrived anywhere. The remaining 7 were found 11 days later by a Lakota hunting party moving through the area. 3 were dead inside the camp. The other 4 were alive, but in a condition that the Lakota hunters described later, through interpreters, as the closest to gone that a living person can be. 2 of those 4 lost fingers to frostbite in the weeks that followed. 1 lost 3 toes on his left foot. The 4th recovered fully, which was considered remarkable by everyone who heard the account. The Lakota hunting party brought all 4 survivors to their winter camp, a village of approximately 40 lodges situated in a river bend about 6 miles from where the trading party had collapsed. The survivors were carried inside, warmed slowly, fed carefully, and treated for their injuries with methods that the men did not recognize and could not later describe with any technical accuracy. Within 2 weeks, all 4 were stable enough for travel to be considered. One of the survivors, a man named Charles Alderton from Lancaster, Pennsylvania, kept a journal. He had kept it throughout the trading expedition, and he continued keeping it during his recovery in the Lakota camp, writing entries that became progressively longer and more detailed as his strength returned and his observations sharpened. In those entries, he described the winter camp around him with a mixture of deep gratitude and genuine bewilderment. He wrote about the warmth inside the lodge on nights when he could hear the wind driving hard against the outer covering, and feel, in the slight movement of the structure, the force of what was happening outside. He wrote about the food, specific, carefully prepared food that he did not recognize, but that seemed to restore his strength faster than anything he had eaten in weeks. He wrote about the way the camp was positioned in the landscape, the way the lodges were arranged relative to each other and to the tree line and the river, the way the firewood was stacked and covered, the way the horses were managed through the cold, the way the people moved through the winter with a steadiness and a calm that was entirely unlike anything he had seen from the men in his own party during the 4 days before the rescue. He noticed that the children played outside, not for short, desperate bursts the way settler children ran between buildings in bad weather, but for extended periods, in temperatures that Alderton himself was not yet willing to stand in. He noticed that the men who went out to hunt returned looking tired, but not desperate. He noticed that nobody in the camp appeared to be rationing or anxious about what remained in storage. The winter that had killed 3 of his companions and nearly killed him was, for the 40 lodges around him, simply the season they were in, not an emergency, not a crisis. The season. At the end of one journal entry, he wrote a sentence that he returned to in a letter sent to his brother in Pennsylvania the following spring. He wrote, "They were not surviving the winter. They were living in it. I do not know the difference yet, but I know there is one, and I know it is the reason I am alive." That difference between surviving winter and living in it is exactly what this video is about. To understand why settlers found native winter survival so genuinely confusing, you first have to understand what winter meant to the people arriving from the east, and what strategies they brought with them into environments those strategies had never been designed for. For most European and American settlers of the 18th and 19th centuries, winter was fundamentally an adversary. It was a period to be endured, minimized, and waited out. The strategies that had been developed over generations in Europe and in the more temperate regions of the eastern seaboard were essentially strategies of resistance. Build walls thick and heavy enough to keep cold out, stockpile enough food in autumn to last until spring, stay close to the fire, reduce movement, and wait for the season to end. This approach worked reasonably well in the environments where it had been developed. The winters of Central Europe, of England, of the eastern seaboard from Virginia to Massachusetts. These were cold, sometimes dangerous, occasionally severe. But they were winters, where a solid building and a large fireplace and adequate food storage got most people through. The framework was sufficient for the challenge it had been built around. It was not sufficient for the northern plains. It was not sufficient for the Great Basin, the upper Midwest, the Rocky Mountain valleys, or the high desert of the Southwest in winter. These were environments where winter was not a colder version of what settlers knew. It was a different phenomenon entirely. The temperature swings in the northern plains were more extreme and more sudden than almost anything in the European or Eastern American experience. A morning that began at 30 degrees above zero could end at 30 degrees below, a 60-degree drop in a single day, with no gradual transition to allow bodies or buildings or animals to adjust. Storms arrived faster and with less warning than in terrain, where approaching weather systems were visible from a distance. The wind on the open plains was not a background condition, but an active force, capable of driving cold through clothing and walls that would have been perfectly adequate in Ohio or in Germany, and the distances between shelter and any form of help were measured in days of travel rather than hours, which meant that any failure of equipment, clothing, food, or judgment had consequences that could not be quickly corrected. Settlers applied Eastern strategies to Western winters and were repeatedly, consistently, and in many cases fatally destroyed by the distance between what they expected and what they encountered. The historical record of the northern plains in the mid-19th century contains account after account of settler parties and isolated families who had prepared adequately by every standard they knew and found those preparations entirely insufficient when a serious winter arrived. The native nations who had lived in these specific environments for generations, in many cases for thousands of years, had developed something categorically different, not strategies of resistance, but strategies of integration. They did not approach winter as something to be kept outside. They built systems, material and practical and ecological, that worked with winter rather than against it. Systems that used the specific rhythms and characteristics of the season, that accounted for its extremes and its unpredictability, and that positioned communities to remain not just physically alive, but functionally healthy, adequately fed, and socially cohesive through its entire duration. The difference between these two approaches was not a matter of toughness or courage or willingness to endure hardship. The settlers who died on the northern plains were often people of extraordinary toughness who had survived genuinely difficult lives. The difference was knowledge, multi-generational, empirically developed, continuously refined knowledge of a specific environment applied through specific technologies and practices that looked simple to outside observers precisely because they worked so well that they required no visible struggle. That invisibility was itself part of the confusion. When something works seamlessly, it is easy to miss how much thought and experience went into making it work. The settlers saw the calm and could not find the system underneath it. The first thing Charles Alderton noted about the Lakota winter camp, before he could assess anything else about it, was its position in the landscape. The camp was not on open ground. It was not on elevated terrain with a wide view in all directions, which was the position that military logic and common sense both seemed to suggest was advantageous. It was not beside the main channel of the river, where water access would have been most direct. It was positioned in the bend of a secondary channel, on a south-facing slope of a low hill, with dense stands of mature cottonwood and willow on three sides, and the river bend creating a natural boundary on the fourth. Every element of that positioning was deliberate. Every element served a specific function, and the functions were interconnected in ways that made the overall placement substantially more effective than any single element would have been alone. The river bend first. Moving water freezes more slowly than still water, and a river bend creates a particular hydraulic condition on the inside curve of the bend. The water slows, the channel is shallower, and ice formation, when it does occur, is thinner and more easily broken through than in the main channel or in still water. For a village of 40 lodges with horses to water and people to keep supplied through a winter that could last 4 months or more, reliable access to liquid water was not a convenience. It was one of the most critical logistical requirements of the season. The camp was positioned within easy walking distance of the most reliably accessible water in the area, and the choice of that specific bend rather than the main channel or any other section of the river, was not random. The south-facing slope carried its own thermal logic. In the northern hemisphere, a south-facing slope receives direct sunlight at a significantly more favorable angle than flat ground or a north-facing slope through the winter months. The sun is lower in the sky during winter, which means its energy strikes south-facing surfaces more directly and warms them more effectively. A community of lodges on a south-facing slope absorbed more solar energy during the day and retained that warmth longer into the evening than the same lodges would have on flat ground. This effect was not dramatic on any single day. Accumulated over a winter of 100 days or more, it represented a significant reduction in the fuel required to maintain livable interior temperatures. The sun was doing work that the fire would otherwise have had to do. The cottonwood and willow stands provided wind protection that was, in the conditions of the northern plains, arguably the single most important physical factor in the camp's survival capacity. Wind on the open plains in winter is not simply uncomfortable, it is thermodynamically devastating. A temperature of 0 degrees Fahrenheit with no wind is manageable with adequate clothing and shelter. The same temperature with a sustained wind of 30 miles per hour produces an effective cold exposure, equivalent to somewhere around 30 below zero. The cottonwood stands around the Lakota camp reduced wind speed at ground level by a factor that meant the people inside that camp were, in thermodynamic terms, living in a substantially warmer environment than anyone standing on open ground half a mile away, even though the air temperature measured by a thermometer at both locations would have been identical. Alderton did not understand any of this when he arrived. He saw trees and a river and a hillside. He did not see a system. Over the 2 weeks of his recovery, as he watched the camp function through conditions that had nearly killed him on open ground, he began to understand that the position of the camp was not incidental. It was foundational. Everything that worked well about the camp worked partly because of where the camp was. This knowledge, the ability to read a winter landscape and identify within it the specific combination of features that would support a community through the worst months, was not something that could be acquired quickly. It required knowing how wind moved through specific terrain types. It required knowing which river bends stayed unfrozen longest and why. It required knowing which slopes received the most winter sun and how much difference that made in practice. It required, in other words, the kind of detailed environmental knowledge that only comes from spending many winters in a specific landscape, watching carefully, and receiving instruction from people who had been watching even longer. The settlers moved into the northern plains with maps that showed rivers and elevations and distances. The maps did not show winter wind patterns. They did not show solar exposure angles. They did not show the thermal properties of river bends or the wind reduction capacity of specific tree stands. The information that determined whether a winter camp would sustain a community or destroy it was not on any map that settlers carried. It was in the knowledge of the people who had been living there for generations, and it was not information that transferred easily or quickly across the cultural gap. The teepee has been reproduced as decoration, reduced to a symbol, and turned into a cultural shorthand to the point where most people today cannot look at one and see what it actually was. What it actually was, in the context of winter survival on the northern plains, was one of the most effective portable shelter systems ever built, by any culture, in any environment. The shape is the first thing to understand, and the shape is not aesthetic. The conical form of the teepee is an engineering solution to the specific problem of building a structure that can withstand northern plains wind while remaining portable enough to be moved multiple times per year. A cone distributes wind load along its entire surface simultaneously, with no flat face for the wind to push against directly. The angled walls channel wind upward and around the structure rather than into it. In sustained high winds, the teepee does not fight the force applied to it. It deflects that force continuously, flexing slightly under gusts and recovering, absorbing energy rather than resisting it rigidly. Rigid structures that resist wind fail when the wind exceeds the structure's resistance threshold. The teepee's design does not have that threshold in the same way. It has been documented functioning in winds that destroyed substantial log structures nearby. The smoke hole at the apex of the cone was not a simple opening for smoke to exit. It was a ventilation system of real sophistication, managed by two adjustable wing-shaped flaps that could be repositioned from inside the lodge using long poles. The angle and position of these flaps relative to the wind direction determined the airflow pattern inside the lodge, specifically whether the fire's smoke was drawn upward and out efficiently or whether it backdrafted into the interior. An experienced person managing the flaps could maintain a smoke-free interior with a strong central fire in variable wind conditions by continuously adjusting the flap positions as the wind shifted. This required understanding of how air moved through a heated enclosed space with a top opening, an understanding that was practical rather than theoretical, but that aligned with principles that engineers would not formalize for another century. The liner was perhaps the least visible and most important element of the teepee's winter performance. A teepee liner was a second layer of material, hide or later canvas, that hung around the interior perimeter of the lodge from ground level to a height of approximately 5 or 6 feet. It was not in contact with the outer covering. Between the liner and the outer wall, an air gap of several inches existed all the way around the lodge. This air gap functioned as thermal insulation by the same principle that makes modern double-pane windows and insulated wall construction effective. Still air is a very poor conductor of heat, and a layer of still air between two surfaces slows heat transfer dramatically. Cold air outside the lodge had to cross the outer covering, travel down through the air gap, and then penetrate the inner liner before it could affect the interior temperature. The liner also served a secondary function. Cold air that did infiltrate under the outer covering was channeled downward through the gap and directed under the liner rather than into the living space, where it was warmed before it entered the interior or escaped under the base of the structure. The floor of the lodge was covered with hides, layered and overlapping, extending from the central fire area to the edges of the interior. Ground insulation is one of the most consistently underestimated factors in cold weather survival. The ground conducts heat away from a human body significantly faster than still air does, which means that lying or sitting on bare frozen ground, even in an otherwise warm environment, produces dangerous rates of body heat loss. The layered hide floor of the teepee eliminated this problem entirely. People sleeping on several layers of buffalo hide over frozen ground were adequately insulated from ground cold throughout the night, which meant their bodies were not continuously working against ground conduction while simultaneously trying to stay warm in cold air. The fuel saved by this insulation, the metabolic fuel of the people inside and the fire fuel that would otherwise have been required to compensate, was significant over the course of a winter. The combined effect of all of these design elements working in concert, the shape, the smoke management system, the liner, the floor, was a structure that could maintain an interior temperature comfortable enough for people to sleep without heavy outer garments in weather that was 40 or 50 degrees colder outside, with a relatively small central fire as the only heat source. In conditions that were defeating the settlers' log cabins, despite those cabins being substantially heavier, more permanent structures. A log cabin, built quickly by settlers moving into new territory, was typically a single wall structure with significant gaps in the chinking between logs, a door that did not seal well, and a fireplace that drew heated interior air up and out through the chimney even when the fire was burning well. The fireplace heated one end of the cabin, while cold air was continuously pulled in through gaps and cracks at the other end to replace the air being exhausted. The net thermal efficiency of this arrangement was poor. In a moderate winter, it was workable. In a severe northern plains winter, it was frequently insufficient to prevent the interior temperature from falling to dangerous levels during the coldest nights. The settlers could look at a teepee and see something smaller and simpler than their cabins. They were looking at it wrong. They were measuring size and mass when the relevant measurements were insulation, airflow management, ground separation, and shape efficiency. On every one of those measurements, the teepee in the hands of experienced users outperformed the settler cabin in northern plains winter conditions. The engineering was invisible because it was built from knowledge rather than from mass. In the winter of 1856, a sustained cold period descended on southern Minnesota that became known in the settler communities of the region as the hard winter. It began in November with a series of storms that deposited heavy snow across the river valleys and upland prairies, followed by a temperature drop that settled in and remained. The cold did not break meaningfully until late February. For approximately 3 months, the region experienced conditions that exceeded what the settler communities had prepared for. The settlers in the area had arrived over the previous several years and had established small farming communities along the river corridors. Most had log homes, stored food from the autumn harvest, and firewood cut and stacked for the season. They were not naive or unprepared people. They had been through previous Minnesota winters and believed they understood what the season required. What they had not encountered was a winter that sustained its extremes for 3 months, without the periodic warming breaks that made normal winters manageable. By January, multiple families had exhausted their firewood supplies and were burning furniture to stay warm. Several households had run through their stored food faster than projected because the cold was demanding more calories than normal activity levels required, and they had not anticipated that differential. Men attempting to hunt in the worst conditions were taking serious risks. At least 2 suffered frostbite during hunting attempts, and 1 broke through ice crossing a river and survived only because he was close enough to a settlement to reach shelter before hypothermia became irreversible. At least 7 settlers in the broader region died during that winter from cold, from illness that the cold exacerbated, or from accidents in storm conditions. Approximately 12 miles from one of the hardest-hit settler communities, a Dakota village of around 30 families spent the same winter without a single death from cold or starvation. A Norwegian settler named Gunnar Eriksson, who survived the hard winter and documented it in letters sent home to relatives in Norway over the following 2 years, described visiting the Dakota village in the spring of 1857. He had been brought there by a neighbor who had maintained a trading relationship with the Dakota for several years and could communicate in basic terms through a combination of their language and sign. Eriksson went partly out of curiosity, and partly, he admitted, because he wanted to understand something that had been troubling him since February: how 30 families 12 miles away had come through a winter that had killed 7 people in his community and left most of the survivors in weakened condition. His description of what he found is careful and honest in a way that makes it valuable as historical record. He wrote that his first reaction on approaching the village was that the lodges looked smaller than he expected. He had built in his mind an image of something large and heavily constructed, because in his experience, surviving a winter like the one they had just come through required mass, thick walls, deep cellars, substantial structures. What he saw instead were lodges that appeared, from the outside, to be modest in scale. He had to adjust his framework immediately. He wrote about the position of the village, the way it sat in the landscape, and noted, without fully understanding it, that the wind he had felt on the open ground approaching the village dropped significantly as he entered the tree cover around the camp. He noted that the ground inside the camp on the south-facing slope still held patches of bare earth where the sun had cleared snow that remained deep on the north-facing ground around the perimeter. He noticed these things as details, without yet connecting them to the larger system they were part of. What arrested his attention most completely was what he initially took to be mounds of disturbed earth arranged near the edge of the village. He described them in his letter as looking like old graves or perhaps refuse mounds, and said that he had been prepared to look away from them out of respect or discretion before his neighbor explained what they were. They were cache pits, underground food storage chambers, dug to a depth that placed the storage space below the frost line, where ground temperature remained cold and stable throughout winter. Cold enough to preserve food reliably, but not the killing cold of the surface, and not subject to the freeze-thaw cycles that destroyed above-ground storage. The pits were lined with bark and layers of dried grass for additional insulation. They had been packed in the late autumn with carefully processed food and sealed against moisture and animals. When one of the pits was opened in Eriksson's presence, he wrote that he felt embarrassed by his surprise. Inside the pit, protected and preserved after 3 months underground through the hardest winter he had experienced, were quantities of dried meat, dense cakes of rendered fat mixed with dried meat and berries, dried corn, dried roots, and other items he could not identify. Everything was in usable condition. Nothing had rotted. Nothing had frozen into the inedible solid masses that had destroyed portions of his own family's stored food that winter. His family's root cellar had partially frozen in January. They had lost a significant portion of their vegetable stores to that freezing, and the remainder had been damaged enough that it spoiled earlier than expected in the spring. He had attributed this to bad luck and to the unusual severity of the winter. Standing beside the Dakota cache pits in the spring thaw, he understood that it was not bad luck. It was the difference between a storage system designed for the environment and a storage system imported from somewhere else and hoped to work. He wrote to his brother in Norway. The ground was doing the work. They simply knew how to use it. We were fighting the cold. They had made the cold do their work for them. Staying warm is only half of surviving winter. The other half is maintaining the physical capacity to stay warm, which requires adequate calories, specific nutrients and food that remains accessible and preparable in conditions where fuel is limited and temperatures make cooking both difficult and dangerous. The food systems developed by plains and northern woodland nations addressed all of these requirements with a sophistication that, when examined through the lens of modern nutritional science, turns out to be remarkably precise. The most important single food technology in this context was pemmican. Pemmican is a processed food consisting of dried lean meat, typically bison on the plains, combined with rendered fat and, in many traditional preparations, dried berries. The components were processed separately and then combined into dense cakes or packed into containers for storage. It sounds simple. What it represents nutritionally and practically is extraordinary. The caloric density of well-made pemmican is among the highest of any traditional food. A pound of pemmican provides roughly 3,000 calories, enough to sustain a physically active adult for a full day in cold conditions when caloric requirements are elevated by the body's continuous work of maintaining core temperature. The fat content is high, which is exactly what cold weather physiology requires. The body metabolizes fat into sustained thermal energy far more effectively than it metabolizes carbohydrates in sustained cold exposure. The protein content maintains muscle function and immune response over extended periods without fresh food. The berry component, where included, provided vitamin C and other micronutrients that prevented the nutritional deficiencies, particularly scurvy, that devastated many settler communities during long winters when fresh plant foods were entirely unavailable for months at a time. Critically, pemmican required no cooking before eating. It could be consumed directly in any condition, regardless of weather, fuel availability, or circumstances. In a situation where fire starting was difficult, where fuel had run low, or where conditions made preparing food dangerous, all situations that the settlers in the hard winter of 1856 faced, pemmican remained fully accessible. It was food engineered for the specific moment when every other food option failed. The contrast with settler winter food was stark. Settlers stored cornmeal, dried beans, salted pork, root vegetables, and grain. All of these required cooking or at minimum thawing before they could be eaten. Cornmeal in a frozen bag is not food until it has been heated with liquid into something edible, which requires fire and water and time. Salted pork that has frozen solid requires extended thawing. Root vegetables that have partially frozen spoil in ways that cooked cornmeal does not. In the conditions of a severe northern plains winter, the settler food system required a functioning fire and reasonable conditions to operate. When the fire became difficult to maintain and conditions deteriorated, the food system began to fail along with it. Beyond pemmican, the food processing knowledge of plains nations encompassed dozens of specific techniques that solved specific problems created by northern winters. Methods of drying meat quickly and efficiently during the autumn hunting season to prevent spoilage before storage. Methods of rendering fat that removed the impurities that caused rancidity, extending the effective storage life of fat-based foods by months. Methods of processing plant foods, camas root, prairie turnips, various berries, into dried or otherwise preserved forms that retained their nutritional value through winter storage without refrigeration. Methods of preparation that combined ingredients in ways that provided complete nutrition even when individual food sources were not available in their fresh form. This was not cooking in the sense of making food taste pleasant. It was applied nutrition science, developed in response to a precise challenge. How do you maintain the health and physical capacity of a community through 4 to 6 months of winter in an environment where fresh food is largely inaccessible? And refined over generations until the answer worked reliably. The testing was not theoretical. Every winter was a test. A food system that failed in February, when hunting was difficult and stored food was running low, showed its failure immediately and irreversibly. The food systems that survived in use were the ones that had been tested against the worst conditions the environment could produce and had not failed. By the time settlers arrived to observe them, they were looking at systems from which the failures had already been removed. Charles Alderton described the clothing of the Lakota people around him with an attention to detail that suggests he spent considerable time thinking about why it worked as well as it obviously did. He wrote about robes and leggings and moccasins that appeared from outside to be simply animal hides shaped into garments. He understood, after 2 weeks of watching people move through conditions that would have been immediately dangerous to anyone wearing settler clothing, that what he was seeing was not simply, it just looked that way. The preparation of hides for winter clothing in Plains nations involved processes that produce materials with properties fundamentally different from the commercially tanned leather that settlers wore. Brain tanning, processing hide with an emulsion made from the animal's brain, produced a leather that was soft and pliable at temperatures far below zero. This characteristic was not aesthetic, it was functional in the most direct sense. Clothing that stiffens in extreme cold loses its insulating capacity because stiff garments create gaps, lose their fitted shape, and break down the system of trapped air layers that provides actual thermal protection. Our brain-tanned hide garment moved with the body at 30 below zero the same way it moved at 50 above. Commercially tanned leather did not. The layering principle was built into traditional Plains winter clothing in ways that settler clothing typically was not. Multiple lighter garments worn in layers trap air between them, and that trapped air, warmed by body heat and held in place by the garment layers, is the actual insulating medium. The garments themselves are not warm. The air they trap is warm. This principle is now understood well enough that every technical cold weather garment made today is designed around it. Traditional Plains winter clothing had been designed around it for centuries, not as a theory, but as the accumulated result of understanding what happened to people when the clothing system failed. The buffalo robe, worn with the hair turned inward against the body, created a microclimate against the skin. Individual hairs of the bison's winter coat are hollow. They trap air within themselves, in addition to trapping air between them. The surface in contact with the body was dense, warm, and moved air minimally. The outer surface, smooth hide, shed wind and moisture. The combination of an inner insulating layer and an outer weather-resistant layer was the same two-layer principle built into every effective modern cold-weather outer garment, arrived at independently through generations of practical testing. Footwear deserves particular attention because foot failure in winter is not a minor problem. Frostbite that begins in the feet can progress to require amputation. Wet feet in extreme cold can kill. The moccasin construction used by Plains nations in winter involved multiple layers. A soft inner layer directly against the foot, a tougher outer layer of heavier hide, and in serious winter conditions, additional insulation from layered plant material or extra hide, combined with construction that fitted closely enough to the foot to minimize unwarmed dead airspace while maintaining enough room that blood circulation was not restricted. That last balance, close enough to trap and hold body-warmed air, loose enough not to restrict circulation, is the central challenge of cold-weather footwear design. Modern cold-weather boot manufacturers spend significant resources on it. Plains nations had solved it empirically through the same process that had refined everything else in their winter knowledge system, making footwear, watching what happened to feet, adjusting the construction until the failures stopped occurring. Settler boots were rigid leather, frequently poorly fitted, almost impossible to waterproof effectively in the field, and stiff in cold conditions in ways that both reduced insulation and restricted circulation. The leather sole conducted cold directly into the foot. In conditions that were routine for people wearing traditional winter moccasins, settler boots were a significant and, in some cases, fatal liability. There is a pattern that runs through every element described in this video: the camp placement, the lodge design, the food systems, the clothing, and it is worth naming clearly and directly. None of these things were discovered quickly. None of them were the product of individual insight or sudden invention. All of them were the result of a process of development that operated across generations, in an environment that provided immediate and severe consequences for error, and that therefore filtered out failed approaches with a ruthlessness that no laboratory testing protocol could replicate. Winter on the northern plains does not forgive errors in camp placement. A village positioned wrong loses people to wind and cold in the first serious storm of the season. It cannot move camp during the worst of winter without risking the lives of everyone in the community. The decision made in the autumn, when the winter camp was established, was binding. It was therefore made with all of the accumulated knowledge the community possessed about how weather moved through specific terrain, and it was made by people who had been observing that movement their entire lives. Winter does not forgive errors in food storage. A cache system that fails in January leaves a community with diminishing stores and no reliable way to supplement them until conditions allow extended hunting again. The consequence is not discomfort. It is starvation. The food systems that survived in use were the ones that had been tested against the worst possible conditions and had not produced starvation. By definition, they were the ones that worked. Winter does not forgive errors in clothing construction. A garment that fails in a storm fails at the moment it is most needed and cannot be repaired or replaced in the field. The people wearing it die. The construction methods that remained in use were the ones that had not produced this outcome across the range of conditions the environment created. This is what the settlers were observing and could not find a framework to explain. They were looking at systems that had been tested against reality over timescales, longer than their civilization had existed in North America, in the specific environment where those systems were being applied, by people who had no margin for error and therefore had eliminated errors over generations of refinement. The calm they saw was not stoicism or toughness. It was the visible expression of systems that worked so well that they had eliminated most of the situations that produce panic. The settlers were not less intelligent. They were not less capable. They were applying knowledge from a different environment to a situation that environment had not prepared them for, and the gap between what they knew and what the land required of them was, in a mild winter, uncomfortable. In a hard winter, it was measured in the number of people who did not survive until spring. Charles Alderton left the Lakota winter camp in early March of 1849, when the weather had moderated enough that travel was possible without serious risk. On the morning of his departure, he wrote a final entry in his journal from inside the lodge, where he had spent 2 weeks recovering. He described what he could see from where he was sitting, the smoke rising from the central fire, the light coming through the smoke hole, the sounds of the camp outside beginning its morning. Then he went out and stood in the cold morning air and looked at the camp around him. He looked at the river bend, still partially frozen at the edges, but running clear and dark in the center channel. He looked at the cottonwood stands, bare-branched in late winter, and noticed that standing inside them he could hear wind moving through the upper branches that he could barely feel at ground level. He looked at the south-facing slope of the hill, where the snow was already beginning to pull back from the base of the lodges on the warmest exposures. He looked at the arrangement of the lodges, the positioning of the wood stores, the placement of everything that had made 40 families functional, through a winter that had nearly killed him in 4 days on open ground. He wrote that he felt, standing there, that he had spent 2 weeks inside something he had not had the vocabulary to understand while he was in it. He had been warm and fed and safe, and the warmth and the food and the safety had seemed to simply exist, to be present the way daylight is present, without obvious mechanism. It was only standing outside on his last morning, looking at the whole of the camp in the clear early light, that the structure of it began to become visible to him. The river position, the slope, the trees, the lodges and everything in them, the food in the ground beneath the mounds he had walked past every day. None of it had happened by accident or by luck. All of it was the product of knowledge, specific, accumulated, empirically tested knowledge of that specific place and that specific season, held by people who had been adding to it and refining it for longer than his country had existed. In the letter he sent to his brother in Pennsylvania that spring, the one where he had written that the people around him were not surviving winter but living in it, he added a final line that his brother kept and that survived in the family archive long enough to be published in a collection of frontier correspondence in the early 20th century. He wrote, "The most dangerous thing a man can carry into a new country is the certainty that he already knows how to live there." The people who had saved his life had not arrived anywhere with certainty. They had arrived with their ancestors' knowledge, and they had added to it every winter, and they had passed it forward to the generation behind them until winter was not a thing that could kill them with a storm and 4 days of open ground. It was simply the season they were best at. If any part of this story stayed with you, the cache pit sitting just below the frost line, while the hard winter raged above them, the lodge that held warmth in conditions that were killing people half a mile away, the children playing outside in temperatures that had incapacitated trained men, or the settler who stood in the morning light and finally began to see the system he'd been living inside. Write it below. Because the difference between surviving something and knowing how to live inside it is still one of the most important distinctions a person can understand. And this history deserves to be remembered.